Hello, I'm Joshua and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and consequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on creativity, chaos, self, and meditation. I'm reshooting this video because, and the first time I tried to present this idea, I don't think that I fully articulated some of the arguments that I was hoping to make in the greatest extent, and that I did not clearly represent the position I was hoping to take. It is the case that I am not a fan of a certain school of meditation which is centered around mindfulness, and one form of meditation that's of this nature is boxed meditation. And what neurological research shows is that specific types of meditation that are geared towards being more mindful, and the activity of being mindful is one of clearing up the mind's internal dialogue and quieting the chattery voice of thought and the wayward nature of the mind, and alleviating the chaotic symptoms of psychological states, and lessening negative emotion. That this type of meditation leads to a develop more gray matter tissue development in the prefrontal region, and leads to a greater myelination fidelity of the executive functions, which many would find as a wonderful thing, but it also leads to a downregulation of the precuneus and parietal regions of the brain, which are very much so responsible for the wondrous nature of the mind. When the precuneus is active in the day-to-day space, it is usually geared towards self-interested thought and one's own contemplation of their interest, and it's also the case that it's in the business of trying to collect the salience factors of what's going on in the environment. And it's the case that if you're not sufficiently stimulated to a certain extent by the environment, that your mind will wander and you will daydream. And so here in the West, we like to be ever so present and consistently diligent and amenable to the advances and suggestions of others, and as a means to persuade them and win favor. And we are very much about meeting deadlines and the conscientious and extroverted interest of the personhoods out in the world. And so it's the case that in America, we are trying to rid ourselves of chaos, and even Jordan B. Peterson's book is titled An Antidote to Chaos. And so it's the case that this form of meditation, because of its negative effects on the precuneus and parietal regions, and its hyperdevelopment of the prefrontal region, it stands to reduce creative insight and ideation and fantasy in the individual. When you try to close down the activity of the roaming mind, or the tendency for the brain to reflect on self and indulge fantasy, you clap imagination, and you rid your brain of coming up with the more looser associations that it does, can, and will do. And so I see this form of meditation and the general sentiment and attitude of most of the motions and most of the direction of American culture as an antithesis or an enemy to creativity. And if it stands as an enemy to creativity, then it is ultimately an enemy to ingenuity and genius. I and as somebody who prizes both creativity, culture, genius, and just human welfare, I don't find that observation a very uplifting or exciting one. In fact, it's quite disheartening, the attitude that America has to certain factors of human nature, and the complete bastardization that negative emotions receive, and the problematic attitude that most systems of thought have towards chaos, and the factor and function of chaos and suffering in life. Now, it's the case that um, uh, with that, I suppose I should start here. That I should mention this as an aside. I should say better. I am not against meditation completely. It is only certain forms and schools of meditation that seem to be most popular in the West, but not things that are kept. They're parts of certain sects of Eastern philosophy, in terms of certain sects of Buddhism, but it's not the complete description nor the tail of the tape when it comes to meditation as a practice in religious or philosophical systems. And so I'm not trying to say that that's the case, and I hope that I'm not mischaracterizing what meditation. I'm not trying to mischaracterize meditation as a practice in general. However, there is a certain sect and school of Buddhism and Zen Buddhism in particular that focuses on mindful meditation and being mindful, or box meditation. And I think that it's probably not what the West needs more of. Focused and sustained attention is something that's much coveted in a pragmatic or a practical setting, where you're trying to achieve something and you're result and goal oriented. But the problem is, creativity is not conducive to the pursuit of goals, nor the motion of procedural mandates, or just the adherence to certain forms of protocol, standard forms of protocol and practice. And it's the case that creativity also is not more, I should say, more problematic. More problematic, even more so, is the fact that creativity is not oftentimes a phenomenon that occurs on the coattails of positive emotion. In fact, from what I can tell from psychological research in terms of the psychological literature, it's not the case that neurotic people are far more creative than other people, and there's a chance that neuroticism inhibits creativity, but it is also the case that neuroticism has a strange correlation with creativity as well. Negative emotion has a strange correlation with certain forms of creativity. It's also the case that, especially creativity within the language arts, music, and most fields. I mean, even in scientific advancements, one thing people don't know about Einstein is that he was quite depressed and loathsome in his nature. He really loathed himself and the direction of his life when he was developing the special and general theory of relativity, and he had quite the tumultuous home life, and didn't exactly get along with his wife, and various other things. And so it's in the I guess grip of negative emotion that he was inspired to distance himself from his regular day-to-day affairs to a world full of what he felt was physical and natural wonder and awe. And it's the case that you are probably not going to be creative if you're not displeased, angry, or unsatisfied with something in your life or something about the world. It's the case that the demonions, the daemons of your cognitive landscape, your capacity for anger and rage, your capacity for sadness and sorrow, your capacity for pain and disappointment are quite oftentimes the agents and instigators of a creative reverie or a creative I would guess embarkment. You typically don't want to traverse the very arduous path of a true creative breakthrough, because it's the case that dealing with the problem of your own ignorance and dealing with your negative emotion is not the easiest thing in the world. And it's also the case that the creative process is not one that's very rich with positive emotion. You do feel positive emotion when you have a breakthrough or when you have a eureka moment or when you finally solve the problem. But before you experience that heaven, you walk through a very serious hell. And that's why most creative people are either very open and extroverted. So they have a facet of plasticity and a large amount of positive emotion that buttresses them against the potential affronts of their own image of competency and efficacy, the ridicule and judgmental factors of self, and quite frankly, the ridicule and judgment of other people. It's the case that they have high levels of negative emotion. I mean, like usually, or in low levels of negative emotion and high levels of disagreeableness. But it's just the case that you have to do a dance and be a rather spiritually tough individual, to borrow I guess spiritual phrase, to be a creative person. Now, the issue is everything in America seems to be pro extroversion, anti introspection, seems to be rather high on the idea of optimism and positivity and positive emotion. Everyone wants to just experience positive emotion. It's like everybody wants to be happy and drunk off of positive emotion. And negative emotions are very much so villainized and seen as things to get rid of. And chaos is something that we should get rid of. And even some of our best philosophers and psychologists say, well, we can't get rid of it, so we have to deal with it. And it's something to deal with. Not something that's necessary, not even something that's valuable, because most your panic networks and your tendency to like your own comfort makes you feel as if chaos isn't something to value. Certain personality types thrive more in chaos than others, but chaos is the very agent that made us what we are as human beings. Chaos and suffering, they're integral, they're necessary, and they're valuable. And negative emotion is valuable. If you were not angry, you wouldn't defend yourself. I say if you didn't have negative emotion, you would die, because you would not be able to recognize a threat if you didn't have negative emotion. You would not be able to see the faults in others' actions and the faults in your own actions, for that matter. You would not be able to notice your own. You wouldn't be able to take care of yourself because you wouldn't notice your own discomfort or know to act because of your own discomfort. You wouldn't be able to do, you would not really be able to function in a world that is going to act on you, where entropy is a factor in that world. You wouldn't plan, you wouldn't problem solve, you wouldn't do a lot of things. And when you did go, you would be interested in achieving your goals, but you would be too myopic and narrow focused to notice when things are indeed going wrong, and you would also be very difficult to convince, and probably a bit too cavalier in your actions and your decisions. You would also find it very hard for you to be reflective on the things that you've done, and you've whether they be positive or negative. I mean, if you don't have neurotic factors, if you don't have a panic network, if you don't have sadness and grief and shame and pain, you honestly would also have a very difficult time learning from your actions. I mean, extroverts have a very difficult. People who are high in trait extroversion have a very difficult time learning from experience, because they are so much of them is mediated by positive emotion, norepinephrine and dopamine, that it essentially sees the world as one big jungle gym, and is interested in leaping out there and taking a risk. It's not like they don't. To a certain extent, they don't see the risk, so it doesn't bother them. So, I mean, positive emotion has a dark side as well, as people who are sadistic and interested in harming other people typically feel very good in doing so, and typically feel very good about themselves. In fact, people who tend to be bullies and people who tend to be mean-spirited almost have too much, well, it's not almost, they honestly do have too much positive emotion and value themselves far too much. I mean, and they value themselves that much because they have an inordinate amount of positive emotion. And you see it too when people consume a great deal of alcohol. You know, alcoholics can be fun to be around for a certain amount of time, but then after that, after a certain point, they're very problematic and don't make the best decisions. And I'm not saying you're usually not disequilibrated when you're high on positive emotion, but it's the case that positive emotion has its negative features, but we think it's the greatest thing that one can attain, and it's very much been the I guess cornerstone of Western philosophy, that the point of life is to be happy, or the point of life is happiness, and that's not the case, and you can't always be happy, and you shouldn't always try to be happy, and in fact, I think that very really that happiness and creativity are on two different sides of one another. I mean, you can be happy because of being creative, but if you're happy, you won't be creative. Happy, content people are not creative people. Like, that's not true. You have to have negative emotion, and it's the case that by making it such that you disavow negative emotion, and you have no place for it in your society, and you have no place for it in your life, or you're ashamed of it, you won't become a type of person that can be an agent of what I call an agent of meaning. It's the case that to be somebody who is actualized, or a complete individual, you have to be able to stomach your negative emotion. You have to be able to borrow a term from Carl Jung, transmute it. If you don't know how to indulge negative emotion and use it to your advantage, it will be very difficult for you to be an individual that is not characterized by some pathology. You're not an angel. Your thoughts aren't always great. People are not always the nicest things. The world is very harsh, and suffering is an integral part of reality. So you must rely on the shadowy parts of yourself to be somebody who can face the world and themselves and have a meaningful life. I mean, it's necessary. You have to dip your feet in chaos. You know, it's like you have to live with it to some extent. like Jordan B. Peterson says, you must walk the line that mediates between order and chaos. People walk the line because they have to, but you should be willing to dive into it. If you really want to be the type of individual that can be a shining light to other individuals, that those who go to the depths and those who are willing to dive into the darkness of the still water will be those who receive the touch of light and of grace. Those who eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil have the chance to eat from the tree of life. Those who do not care to maintain themselves, those who are willing to go under and to have their image of themselves and their expectations even die. You know, when the Bible says you ought to die to yourself, it's like, you know, there is a way to interpret that in the ways in which Christianity really meant it that makes the Bible, from my estimations, misanthropic. But if you don't take it literally, and you take it as a metaphor, not about heaven, but a metaphor about human psychology, the issue is there's certain parts of you. There's the part of you that is a biological being. There's a part of you that is a behavioral being, which is somewhat historic. The biological, the behavioral, and you're a cultural being. So all three of those things are quasi-historic. And you're a temperamental being. So you're a conglomeration of several things that don't always attend to the same direction, but tend to have a general unison in their direction. So this idea of this unified you is not a very actionable one, and it's not a very good description of what's going on. And even within those frames of self, there is the brain that you know that does the thinking, and there's the brain that you know that you might not know that does more of the thinking than you might quite realize for yourself and your actions and your motivations. And so it's the case that you, as you are, will have items embedded in you, mostly because you're a historical being. You know, you're born ignorant, and so you're going to pick up habits, and you're going to pick up traits, and you're going to be molded and shaped by your environment to a certain extent. You're going to have your own temperamental variances that are incongruent with your natural motivations and the things that you value, and so they're going to have to go away. They're going to have to die. You're going to have to prune them, and it's why Nietzsche says that anyone who is not willing to put a flame to themselves cannot champion the spirit of those who overcome. A true free spirit is willing to burn itself. They're willing to ignite themselves and almost have a disposition and a desire to ignite themselves in flame. Nietzsche borrowed that from the Romantics, but it's the case that the reason why we're interested in that idea in the first place is because it's something about what it means to overcome oneself and what it means to live a meaningful existence. And more so, creativity is very much in this like this in a way, because usually what you first think is wrong. Usually you are incapable of reaching the thing that's just beyond you or just stretched a little far away. And if you're not willing to destroy the old conceptions, the old tomes, if you're not willing to be a lawbreaker and break the laws, if you're not willing to disavow the sacred, or what the masses consider sacred, you won't be able to come up with some creative breakthrough. That's why Picasso said that creativity is first an act of destruction, and it's not like any of these things are very positive, but they have positive ends in mind. But the means, the actual trial, the actual struggle, the sojourning, the fundamental part of what it means to be a complete person is completely steeped in the darkness. It's completely steeped in the negative emotions. And it's the case that if one would only accept what they are in their totality, they would find the means of overcoming the tragedy of existence and becoming an agent of meaning, a person who can generate meaning for themselves and their lives. And like I said in the other video, the truth is you have evolved to find the world meaningful. You will slice the world up in terms of positive meaning and negative meaning. And it's the case that all that you need, all that you would need to find life meaningful is in you. You have a counter and a compass. Like it's quite remarkable. You can mediate yourself. You can take yourself there. You don't need anything else. You really don't need anything else. I mean, how that looks for each person is different, because that's the subjective part about it. But for the most part, in general, it's very necessary, not only for creativity, but for self-actualization, and to be just a real person, to be a complete individual. And what I mean by real is this: most people you talk to are pathological in some form or another. I mean, people have a very hard time being honest with themselves, and I mean, I'm not. And I have to do another video on what I mean. Well, I can explain briefly what I mean about people have a very hard time being honest with themselves. The technical term is false positives. The human brain is more likely to come up with a false positive in terms of an explanation for why something is the way that it is in the world, or an explanation for what they're seeing in any kind of social setting or a personal setting. A false positive is a short conclusion that is fallacious or erroneous in its truth value. And we come up with ideas like that more so than not. I mean, we do come up with some false negatives. I mean, but at least the research and the neuroscience studies show that people are, particularly because of the left hemisphere, we are in the business of coming up with false positives more than we know. And that's why science tells you first that you must deal with the null hypothesis, the fact that you might be wrong, and you have to find reason to reject the null hypotheses, but you first accept it, because the chances that your idea or what you think about the world is correct or is true is wrong. It's probably very, very, very wrong. And it's the case that not only is your brain interested in making false positives, but it also does not like changing its narratives. There's a reason why you can't talk people out of their beliefs, and it's a reason why you can't really... some people you can... I mean, like, this is why it takes a... Well, there's a reason why you can't talk somebody out of their beliefs, because the left hemisphere is not interested in updating its models of the world. Even if it's wrong, it doesn't really care. Because the issue is, when people lose their models or their representations of the world, they become panicked. And it's not really clear why negative emotion is associated with... well, it is to some extent, because your brain is, in some ways, trying to pick out anomaly, and anomaly is basically synonymous with threat. And so the left does not part of the way that the left hemisphere deals with this is it stays positive mostly about things, and it crowds out facts and information that does not fit with its current model of the world. That's why people develop echo chambers in the first place, or why we even have that term. And it's why things like cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias is a very real factor of human cognition, more than people realize. And it's the case that people are not very good at being honest with themselves. Not because they don't want to. When I say the brain doesn't like isn't interested in being honest with itself, I'm not making a moral argument, and I don't think it's necessarily... I find it, in fact, I think it's amoral. The problem is it's not unconsequential. And the issue with a lot of things that people think and believe about human nature is that they're not inconsequential. They have very significant consequences. And part of the consequences that I don't particularly value with people's insistence on the eradication of chaos and the inadvertent eradication of creativity and genius is the fact that all of these things are necessary. I mean, you should suffer. It's good for you. You should deal with some chaos. It's better for you. You should be panicked to some extent. It's better for you to be an individual that can generate meaning. I mean, like, to a certain extent. Like, you obviously don't want to just always go through trauma or something like that. But to be an individual who can generate meaning for themselves and others, you have to do this, or else you'll wind up pathological. Because the fact of the matter is, the brain isn't very interested in being honest with itself, and about the only ways in which you're willing to curb your models is to do it by observation over time, or passively taking in information over time. And when you go to sleep, your right hemisphere will consistently update the left, and you'll start thinking different over days and days on end. Or you have to experience a lot of trauma and pain, because then the right hemisphere just takes over to some extent, and is going to force you to update those models whether you want to or not. And it's oftentimes the case that you should voluntarily go and approach the things in the world that could be a threat to you. And the fact of the matter is that most of mindfulness, most activity and interest in the West is interested in eliminating or eradicating, making it such that those features are no longer a point or a part of life. That's why I hate utopias. Like, and it's like, we really, like, we're possessed, man. We're so ideologically possessed. It's not even funny. So many people have their idols. Like, more idols. There are more idols in this day and age than there were around in biblical times. I mean, like, I'm not kidding. Like, at least I think that way. And that's why I don't like that particular form of meditation. And I don't like what that particular form of the fact that particular form, this particular form of meditation, the mindful school of meditation, is so popular in the West, and the fact that the idea and the school and thought of mindfulness is so bloody freaking popular in the West. Like, it bothers me to no avail, because I am a creative person who values creativity. Not only that, I value genius, and not only that, I value the average, everyday person, and the ability for any person to have a meaningful life, or to live in an equilibrated existence. And many things that we practice, many things that we believe, are very much antithetical to those motivations and values. So they don't make me happy. So okay. Anyway, well, I'm not necessarily supposed to be happy, because if I was happy, I wouldn't make this video. So, whatever. So that's my video. Hopefully you found it interesting, and thank you for watching.